So what are Ukraine and the Russians up to again? The war continues, ladies and gentlemen, and Ukraine's ceasefire attempt ended with the death of Russian prisoners, which is a war crime, so we'll be talking about that today as well. But of course, we'll also discuss the situation on the battlefield and beyond. If you want to know more, be sure to share, like, and comment on this video, and don't forget to help it get more visibility. Now let's continue, or rather start the update. When we look at what's happening inside Ukraine, we see that there's a huge amount of combat activity, a massive number of clashes. But what's very interesting is that over the past month, the Ukrainians have actually managed to gain territory rather than lose it. At the same time, it's very remarkable that even though the Russians have increased the number of their offensive operations, their territorial gains are significantly lower. There are plenty of charts and analyses of the battlefield showing that in the past, when the number of attacks increased, the amount of territory that Ukrainians lost and Russians gained also increased. Now we see that the number of attacks is increasing and even Russian losses are rising, but this doesn't correlate with how much territory the Ukrainians are losing. From this, it is clear that the Russians are currently unable to break through the Ukrainian defenses, and the Ukrainians have adapted better to defense and to the Russian attack tactics. In other words, the Russians will have to find a different approach against the Ukrainian defense. They will have to proceed differently if they want to continue gaining any territory. We can see here on the map, which shows the Ukrainian battlefield live UA map, that the activity, the combat activity is really huge. On all sections of the front, we have a large number of different clashes here, whether bigger or smaller, which is another point that needs to be mentioned. There are more attacks, more Russian attacks, and overall the losses are higher, but there are fewer large-scale attacks. It makes sense, partly because a large attack is easy to detect, so a missile, drone, or something else can quickly be sent against it. At the same time, a large attack is something the Russians are less and less capable of due to logistical problems that are simply caused by the fact that the war has lasted a long time, there isn't that much equipment, and production isn't going very fast either. Simply put, there aren't as many large attacks as before. However, even on today's battlefield, where drones are everywhere, it's still important that when an attack includes an armored vehicle or a tank, it's more effective than when the attack is just infantry or just drones. That's because a drone or a soldier can be taken out by an infantryman, while a tank simply has to be destroyed by another tank, or you need to get a drone operator there, or anti-tank weapons or artillery. It's just more complicated to repel an attack that includes armored vehicles. So for that reason, armored vehicles still have their place in this war. However, let's start where we usually do. Let's take a look at the drone war. It's worth mentioning that in the last 3 or 4 days, there haven't been that many drones because part of the summary includes the Easter ceasefire. During the Easter ceasefire, there were a huge number of ceasefire violations, artillery fire, drones, all these things, but there wasn't any significant bombing like the Russians sending another wave of drones or another wave of missiles. That didn't happen, but in the following days it did. One day it was just about 90 drones, but then it increased to hundreds of drones, and overall, from the end of the Easter ceasefire until today, 551 drones and 7 missiles or rockets have been launched at Ukraine. The port named Izmail was significantly damaged, which is located, here we have Odessa, and the port of Izmail is located here, on the border with Romania. A lot of things were damaged there, and ships that were loading goods in the Izmail area and the Odessa region were also hit and damaged. There was, for example, a ship from Panama showing how far away ships were coming from, loading grain there, and another from Liberia loading corn. These vessels were damaged, but it's not like the Russians were attacking them. They were just damaged. There was also a major attack over Dnipro, during which the Russians killed 5 people, and even today, Ukrainians were shelled. It's not entirely clear yet how many drones were involved, but there is information that the number of dead and wounded today was in the dozens. So this morning, especially early in the morning, there was a large barrage that caused heavy losses, but it's still not completely clear what and where. What's also interesting is that the Ukrainian air defense was very successful, with an effectiveness rate of up to 90%, and they used relatively few, very sophisticated and expensive air defense missiles. As for the Ukrainian attacks on Russia, the Ukrainians managed to strike mainly in Crimea, where they attacked Feodosia, specifically the port of Feodosia, and were able to destroy some drone warehouses and similar targets there. At the same time, there were further attacks on Tuapse, where there are refineries and oil storage facilities. Novorossiysk was also under fire, and we can see that the Ukrainians managed to strike deep inside Russia, for example in Samara. Here we see reported explosions, which is quite significant. This is a fairly large cloud or column of smoke and dust, which could either be the result of a warehouse being hit or the impact of a Flamingo missile, which has a fairly large warhead. And more activity, more smoke, more flames and explosions can be seen from a place called Stelitamak. So even this deep inside Russia, strikes are happening. It's also worth mentioning that the Ukrainians have been attacking border areas quite a lot, such as Belgorod. Here we see a successful strike, and in the Belgorod region in recent days, the Ukrainians have also hit a gas station, or rather a fuel storage, and civilians were killed there. Even a child was injured, I believe, though I'm not entirely sure about the fate of the child. Perhaps the child also died. Nevertheless, yes, that just adds more dead civilians to the number the Ukrainians have already killed. Overall, since the beginning of the war, Ukrainians have killed hundreds of Russian civilians. As for Ukrainian civilians, the Russians have killed over 15,000, so it's definitely disproportionate. And the number of dead Russian civilians has been increasing quite a bit in recent months. The Russians are starting to report more and more dead civilians. This is simply another phase of this war where it seems Ukrainians have stopped taking Russian civilians into consideration. And when they can achieve some military success and put a large number of Russian civilians at risk in the process, it clearly doesn't bother them at all. And since we're talking about what shouldn't be part of war, let's take a look at this war crime. It's called testing the ceasefire. And we've already talked about the fact that there was some kind of Easter ceasefire here. Of course, this Easter ceasefire wasn't perfectly observed. And the Ukrainians wanted to do a kind of test to see if it was safe to transport wounded and captured soldiers along a certain route. Simply put, whether it's safe to move around a certain part of the front and transport the wounded. So they sent the prisoners there, and those prisoners became targets of Russian fire, and they died. So the Russians killed Russian prisoners, and the Ukrainians used these prisoners as guinea pigs. It's a war crime. It's definitely a war crime. You could argue that it was during a ceasefire, so when there's a ceasefire, nothing should actually happen to those soldiers. And the perpetrators are the Russians, who fired at soldiers they believed to be Ukrainians during the ceasefire. So actually the problem is on Russia's side, because if Ukrainians went there, the Russians would kill them during the ceasefire. This way, Russians went there and the Russians killed them during the ceasefire, so the Russians are to blame. Sure, you can justify it like that. On the other hand, that's not how it works. That's not how international law under the Geneva Conventions works. You can't use prisoners for things like testing whether someone will shoot at them. Because regardless of whether there is a ceasefire or not, it's still an armed conflict. And you're sending those prisoners there with the idea that they could be killed. That's why you're sending them there, to protect your own people from being killed. You're knowingly putting them at risk of death, like sending someone through a minefield. Basically, if you send prisoners through a minefield to clear it, that's also a war crime, regardless of the fact that the mines are Russian, right? And this is a similar situation. So yes, this is clearly directly recorded on camera, a Ukrainian war crime. And the soldier or officer who ordered this should be punished for war crimes. Definitely, 100%. And let's hope that happens. If I were, for example, a Czech or European politician, I would appeal to the Ukrainian side to address this situation, to resolve this, because it casts a very bad light on the Ukrainian side. You simply can't use prisoners as test subjects. You can't use them as human shields. You can't use them for these things. You can't. It's a war crime. That's it. Fortunately, the media in the Czech Republic are presenting it as a war crime. Unfortunately, there's too much talk about how the Russians basically brought it on themselves and things like that, you know? Which is true, they can, but I would prefer if there was more focus on the fact that this is simply not how you treat prisoners. So that's that. That's probably the most interesting thing that happened regarding what shouldn't be done and about how the ceasefire worked and the drones and so on and so forth. As for what's happening on the political side, the situation that was recently dealt with in Germany between Ukraine and the Germans is quite interesting. Not only has Ukraine significantly strengthened its ties with the Middle East in recent months, but it has also significantly strengthened its ties with European armies. We've already talked in previous videos about how European armies are increasingly moving toward becoming more drone-based, adopting more robotic soldiers and more drone soldiers. Now we also have cooperation between Germany and Ukraine regarding the fact that Germany will be sending combat-ready men back to Ukraine. And this is something we've talked about as well. Personally, I'm a big supporter of the idea that combat-ready Ukrainians who are in the Czech Republic and, for example, commit a crime here or are involved in offenses like disturbing the peace at night and things like that, should be sent back to Ukraine. I understand that the crime rate among Ukrainians is low. I know about that. I know these aren't any extreme problems. On the other hand, even the low crime rate among Ukrainians should simply be dealt with not by locking them up here, but by sending them to a training camp in Ukraine. And I would say that at that point, the crime rate among Ukrainians in the Czech Republic would drop to zero. Yeah, that's one of those things we can do and we should do. And Ukrainians need their men, so why not? No. Otherwise, as I already mentioned, greater cooperation with Ukraine regarding drone production, whether in Germany or maybe in Norway, is currently being addressed in some way. And those drones are really becoming more and more interesting and increasingly fascinating. Because here we have, for example, a message that Volodymyr Zelensky mentioned in his video, which I released in Czech on my YouTube channel with AI dubbing, so you can listen to it there. Zelensky states Ukrainians captured Russian positions for the first time without sending in soldiers. Of course, that's misleading because it was without deploying soldiers in the sense that first they bombarded those Russian positions with drones and then they sent in these small tanks or combat drones, remote controlled, to drive out the remaining Russians from those places after the drone attack. So it was without deploying soldiers directly on the front line. It was like this. The soldiers were sitting somewhere in the back in a trench and they were sending drones ahead of them. Actually ground drones and aerial drones, suicide drones, those kinds of things. Of course, it wasn't without deploying soldiers, but you could say it was without deploying infantry. However, that was of course sporadic as well. In reality, what happened was that the drone operators wiped them out there. The robotic mini tanks, that is, drone machine guns, mowed them down. And when everything was already wiped out and shot up, the infantry still had to go in to clear out those places, to finish off anything that was still moving. simply to get the job done. You can't say it was done without deploying soldiers, but definitely the use of ground robots and combat drones and these kinds of things drastically reduces casualties. Moreover, this thing, this monstrosity, is insane in that it can hold a position that an ordinary machine gunner wouldn't be able to hold. But this thing can hold it. Why? Because it's not that hard to suppress a machine gunner. You just start shooting at that position, he hides, stops shooting because he could get hit, or the amount of fire decreases and so on. When you have this thing there, you start shooting, you make a hole in it somewhere, maybe shoot off a bolt, just punch holes in it, but the combat effectiveness of the machine practically doesn't decrease unless you hit some hydraulics or something like that. So the combat effectiveness of this thing just won't decrease just because you start spraying it with a machine gun from your side. This thing will keep firing at you, and until you totally blow it to pieces or cut off its connection, it will keep firing at you. It's a much more effective way to hold a perimeter than having a soldier behind a machine gun who can be effectively taken out by a sniper. A sniper can't take this out, you know? An average sniper just can't hit some hose or some hydraulics here or anything like that, but he can easily hit the head of a guy sitting behind a machine gun, by comparison. A very tough, very effective weapon. And it's being used more and more often on the Ukrainian battlefield. So the high-tech Ukrainian battlefield is showing us the battle of the future, and it's something that, of course, even the Baltic armies are adapting to. Estonia, for example, is a leader in the development and production of these combat drones, and that's because, of course, practically nobody lives in Estonia. I think there are about 5 people living there, or something like that. So they need to have a fairly heavily robotized army, and I would say that this is the direction we in the Czech Republic should also be heading. Because we also don't have the strongest army, and our population isn't exactly the most willing to join the military. So this is something that should become standard in the Czech Republic. This combat drone, which has a machine gun or something like that mounted on it. We have this in our army. It's made by Vopka. VOPCZ, but it's not widely deployed, and it should be widely deployed. Every squad should have a robot like that, which they can send ahead, or which can cover them from behind or something like that. Simply put, it should be much more widely deployed. So this is what's happening right now in Ukraine. War crimes, the deployment of more and more robots, increased cooperation between Ukraine and countries of the Arab world and Europe in drone production and sharing drone technologies. Plus, of course, the bombing of either Crimea or Ukrainian territory, or even deep inside Russian territory. The war goes on, more people are dying, but that's just how modern times are. We're living in hell, ladies and gentlemen. And we can only be glad that the only thing this hell does is that its flames and glow just lick our asses, that we're not submerged in it ourselves. So that's it. If you like my work, and if you enjoyed today's update, well, if that's the right word, if you found it useful, give it a like, write a comment about what you think about all this. What's your opinion, for example, on those drones and the expansion of ground drones and so on? And definitely leave a donation if you want to support directly. But if you can't, then a like, sharing, or boosting visibility with that little star that usually pops up on your phone after you hit like is definitely a way to support this. Bye and see you next time. Join the streams.